That morning, I walked into the office with a bruised face, my jaw throbbing so badly that even saying "good morning" felt like swallowing glass. I thought no one would notice. I was used to it. Being a single dad, working as a secretary for a cold female CEO, I had learned how to turn exhaustion invisible. But before I could sit down at my desk, she appeared. Not with a meeting schedule, not with orders. In her hands was a breakfast tray, still steaming. That moment made me wonder, how long had I been wrong about this woman? Let me back up a bit. My name is Ryan Cole, and for the past 3 years, I've worked as a personal secretary to Audrey Lancaster, CEO of Lancaster Consulting. Most people hear secretary and picture someone answering phones and scheduling meetings. They're not entirely wrong. But working for Audrey means being 2 steps ahead of her at all times, anticipating her needs before she voices them, and making sure her day runs like a machine. It's exhausting. It's also the most stable job I've ever had. And when you're raising a 6-year-old son on your own, stability isn't optional. My son's name is Eli. He's the reason I wake up at 5:30 every morning, the reason I keep protein bars in my desk drawer, and the reason I haven't quit even on the days when Audrey's demands feel impossible. His mom left when he was 2. No warning, no explanation that made sense. Just a note on the kitchen counter and an empty closet. I spent the first year after that in a fog, barely holding it together. But Eli needed me, and somewhere along the way, I figured out how to be both mom and dad. I learned to braid hair, pack lunches that didn't get traded away, and show up to parent-teacher conferences without looking like I was drowning. The boxing came later. A guy at the office mentioned a gym near my apartment, said it helped him blow off steam. I didn't think much of it at first, but one night after Eli went to bed, I found myself standing outside the place, staring at the neon sign. I walked in, paid for a trial session, and spent an hour hitting a heavy bag until my knuckles bled through the wraps. It felt good. Not the pain, but the release. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about bills or bedtime routines, or whether I was screwing up my kid. I was just moving, breathing, existing in my body instead of my head. I started going twice a week, then 3 times. The coach, a retired boxer named Tommy, saw something in me and offered to train me for real. Nothing professional, just sparring sessions with other guys at the gym. It gave me something that belonged to me alone, something that had nothing to do with being a dad or an employee. In the ring, I wasn't Ryan the secretary or Ryan the single parent. I was just Ryan, trying not to get hit. Audrey never asked about my personal life, and I never volunteered information. Our relationship was professional, clean, bordered by mutual respect and zero small talk. She was brilliant at her job, the kind of person who could walk into a boardroom and command attention without raising her voice. People called her cold, and maybe they were right. She didn't laugh at jokes, didn't join the office for happy hour, and rarely said thank you. But she was fair, and she never made me feel small, which was more than I could say for most bosses I'd had. That Tuesday night, I went to the gym like always. Tommy paired me with a new guy, someone visiting from out of town who wanted a hard session. I should have known better. The guy was bigger than me, faster, and I was already tired from a long day. But I didn't back down. I never did. We went 3 rounds, and in the last one, he caught me with a right hook that rattled my brain and sent me stumbling into the ropes. I stayed on my feet, but barely. When I touched my face afterward, my jaw felt like it had been hit with a brick. Tommy handed me an ice pack and told me to take a few days off. I nodded, but I already knew I wouldn't. I couldn't afford to miss work, not with rent due and Eli's school tuition coming up. Besides, I'd been hurt before. Bruises healed. You just had to push through. I got home around 9, picked Eli up from the neighbor who watched him on gym nights, and got him ready for bed. He asked about my face, his small hand reaching up to touch the swelling. I told him I got hit during practice, that it looked worse than it felt. He frowned, clearly unconvinced, but he was too sleepy to argue. I tucked him in, kissed his forehead, and sat in the kitchen for a while, holding the ice pack against my jaw and wondering if I was too old for this. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd been in a car accident. My face was swollen, the bruise spreading from my jawline up to my cheekbone. Every time I moved my mouth, pain shot through my skull. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, examining the damage. It was bad. Visible. The kind of thing people would notice and ask questions about. I thought about calling in sick, but then I thought about the mortgage payment and the fact that Audrey had a board meeting scheduled that afternoon. She needed me there. So I swallowed some ibuprofen, put on my best shirt, and drove to the office. When I walked through the lobby, the receptionist did a double take but didn't say anything. I made it to my desk without running into anyone else, which felt like a small victory. I sat down, opened my laptop, and started going through Audrey's schedule for the day. She had back-to-back meetings until lunch, a conference call at 2, and the board meeting at 4. I needed to prep documents, confirm attendees, and make sure the presentation slides were updated. Normal stuff. I could do this. Audrey's office door was closed, which meant she was already in. She usually arrived before me, often by an hour or more. I had no idea what she did during that time, but I suspected it involved reviewing reports and drafting emails in that precise, unforgiving tone she was known for. I figured I could avoid her for at least the first hour, maybe longer if I was lucky. I was wrong. 10 minutes later, her door opened, and she stepped out. She was wearing a charcoal suit, her dark hair pulled back in a way that made her look even more severe than usual. She glanced at me, and I saw her eyes flicker to my face. For a second, something shifted in her expression, but it was gone before I could name it. She walked toward me, her heels clicking against the tile floor. I straightened in my chair, bracing myself for whatever she was about to say. But she didn't say anything. She just stood there, looking at me with that unreadable expression. And for the first time since I'd started working for her, I had no idea what she was thinking. Then she turned and walked back into her office, closing the door behind her. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. Maybe she hadn't noticed. Maybe I'd get through the day without having to explain myself. I went back to my computer, trying to focus, but my hands were shaking slightly, and I couldn't tell if it was from the pain or from the strange intensity of her gaze. The first hour passed in a blur. I answered emails, confirmed meeting times, and printed out the documents Audrey would need for her 9 o'clock. My jaw throbbed with every keystroke, and I kept making typos, which wasn't like me. I had to retype the same paragraph 3 times before it looked right. My hands felt clumsy, disconnected from my brain, and the fluorescent lights overhead seemed brighter than usual, drilling into my skull. Around 8:45, Audrey's door opened again. She stepped out holding a folder, her expression as composed as ever. She walked to my desk and set the folder down in front of me. Her voice was calm, businesslike, the way it always was. I need these contracts reviewed before the 10:30 meeting. Check the clauses on page 7 and 12. Make sure the terms match what we discussed last week. I nodded, reaching for the folder. My hand trembled slightly as I opened it, and I hoped she didn't notice. She stood there for a moment, and I could feel her eyes on me. Not just glancing, but studying. I kept my gaze on the documents, pretending to scan the first page, but the words swam in front of me. I blinked hard, trying to focus. Ryan. Her voice cut through the fog in my head. I looked up, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw something in her face that wasn't strictly professional. It wasn't pity exactly, but it was close. Concern, maybe. Or confusion. Are you feeling all right? The question caught me off guard. Audrey didn't ask personal questions. She didn't inquire about health or weekend plans or how you were holding up. She just expected you to show up and do the work. "I'm fine," I said quickly. Too quickly. Just a little tired. She didn't move. Her gaze stayed fixed on my face, specifically on the bruise spreading across my jaw. I resisted the urge to touch it, to cover it with my hand, like a kid caught doing something wrong. "You look like you were in a fight." It wasn't a question, but it felt like one. I forced a smile, which was a mistake, because it made my jaw scream in protest. Something like that. Boxing. Nothing serious. She didn't respond right away. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. I didn't know what else to say, so I looked back down at the contracts, hoping she'd take the hint and walk away. She didn't. "You should see a doctor." "I'm fine," I repeated. "Really. It looks worse than it is." She held my gaze for another long moment, then turned and walked back to her office without another word. The door closed behind her, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands were still shaking. I set the folder aside and pressed my palms flat against the desk, trying to steady myself. The pain in my jaw was getting worse, radiating up into my temple and down into my neck. I needed more ibuprofen, but I'd left the bottle in my car. The rest of the morning crawled by. I made it through Audrey's 9 o'clock meeting, taking notes while she negotiated terms with a potential client. She was sharp as always, never missing a beat. And if she noticed me struggling to keep up, she didn't mention it. By the time the meeting ended, I was exhausted. My head felt like it was full of cotton, and every sound seemed too loud. Back at my desk, I tried to focus on the contracts she'd given me, but the words kept blurring together. I read the same sentence 4 times before giving up and closing my eyes, just for a second, just to rest. I must have zoned out because the next thing I knew, someone was standing in front of my desk. I opened my eyes and found Audrey there, holding a tray. On it was a covered plate, a cup of coffee, and a glass of water. The smell hit me first, warm and savory, and my stomach clenched with sudden hunger. I hadn't eaten breakfast. I'd barely eaten dinner the night before. She set the tray down on the edge of my desk, careful not to disturb the papers I'd been working on. I stared at it, then up at her, completely lost. "What is this?" "Breakfast," she said simply. "You need to eat." I didn't know what to say. In 3 years, Audrey had never brought me anything. Not coffee, not lunch, not even a bottle of water on a long day. She wasn't cruel, but she wasn't nurturing either. She was my boss, and I was her employee, and that was the extent of our relationship. "I don't understand," I said, which sounded stupid the moment it left my mouth. She pulled the cover off the plate, revealing scrambled eggs, toast, and a side of fruit. Steam rose from the eggs, and my stomach growled loudly enough that I was sure she heard it. "You're not functioning at full capacity," she said, her tone as matter-of-fact as if she were discussing a project deadline. "You need food and rest. Since I can't send you home, the least I can do is make sure you eat." I looked at the tray again, then back at her. There was something surreal about the whole situation. Audrey Lancaster, the woman who barely acknowledged birthdays or holidays, had just brought me breakfast. Homemade breakfast, by the look of it. Not something picked up from a cafe or ordered from the cafeteria downstairs. She'd made this. "Did you cook this?" "Yes." The single word hung in the air between us. I didn't know how to process it. Audrey didn't seem like the kind of person who cooked. She seemed like the kind of person who had a meal service or ate protein bars at her desk. But here she was, standing in front of me with a home-cooked meal, looking completely unbothered by how strange this was. "Eat," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Then finish the contracts. I'll push the 10:30 meeting to 11. Before I could respond, she turned and walked back to her office. The door clicked shut, and I was left alone with the tray. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, I picked up the fork and took a bite of the eggs. They were good. Better than good, actually. Seasoned perfectly. Cooked just right. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, and with every swallow, I felt a little more human. By the time I finished, the pain in my jaw had dulled to a manageable ache. The food helped, but it was more than that. It was the gesture itself. The fact that someone had noticed I was struggling and done something about it. I couldn't remember the last time anyone had taken care of me like that. Not since Eli's mom left. Not since I'd learned to do everything myself. I finished the coffee, set the tray aside, and went back to the contracts. This time, the words made sense. I reviewed the clauses Audrey had mentioned, flagged a few inconsistencies, and sent her a summary email before the 11 o'clock meeting. When she came out of her office to head to the conference room, she glanced at my desk and gave a small nod. Better? Yeah, thank you. She didn't smile, but something softened in her expression, just for a second. Good. Let's go. The meeting went smoothly. Audrey was in her element, commanding the room with the same quiet authority she always had. I took notes, pulled up documents when she needed them, and stayed out of the way. By the time we got back to the office, it was nearly 1 in the afternoon, and I was starting to feel the exhaustion creep back in. Audrey went straight to her desk, and I thought that was the end of it. But a few minutes later, she came back out and stopped in front of me. She looked like she was deciding something, weighing her words carefully. I'm going to ask you a question, and I want an honest answer. I nodded, suddenly nervous. Is everything all right at home? The question hit me harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to say yes, to brush it off like I always did, but something in her gaze stopped me. She wasn't asking out of politeness or obligation. She genuinely wanted to know. It's fine, I said carefully. Just the usual single-parent chaos. Work, kid, trying to keep it all together. And the boxing? I hesitated. This was the part I didn't talk about. The part that felt too personal, too vulnerable. It helps, I said finally, with the stress. Gives me somewhere to let it out. She didn't say anything for a moment, and I wondered if I'd said too much. But then she sat down in the chair across from my desk, which she'd never done before. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I know what it's like, she said quietly. Feeling like you have to hold everything together on your own. Like asking for help means admitting you're not strong enough. I stared at her, completely thrown. Audrey Lancaster, the most self-sufficient person I'd ever met, was telling me she understood. It didn't make sense. I don't talk about it, she continued, her voice steady. But I grew up in foster care, 8 different homes before I aged out. I learned early that if I wanted something, I had to get it myself. That if I showed weakness, someone would use it against me. I didn't know what to say. I'd never heard Audrey talk about her past, never even thought to wonder about it. She'd always seemed so complete, so untouchable. I'm not saying our situations are the same, she said, but I recognize the signs. The way you push through exhaustion. The way you don't ask for help, even when you need it. The way you show up no matter what. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. You don't have to do that here. Not with me. The words settled over me like a weight. I wanted to believe her, but I'd spent so long being the only person I could rely on that I didn't know how to let that go. I appreciate that, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. But I'm fine. Really. She studied me for a moment longer, then stood up. All right. But if that changes, I'm here. She walked back to her office, and I sat there, staring at my desk, trying to process what had just happened. The Audrey I thought I knew didn't exist. Or maybe she did. But There was more to her than I'd ever bothered to see. Either way, something had shifted between us, and I didn't know if I was ready for it. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange kind of quiet. Audrey worked in her office, I worked at my desk, and we didn't speak again until the board meeting at 4. But every time I glanced up, I caught myself thinking about what she'd said, about the breakfast, about the fact that she'd noticed I was struggling and cared enough to do something about it. By the time I left the office that evening, my jaw still hurt, and I was still exhausted. But something inside me felt different. Lighter, maybe. Or just less alone. The board meeting started at 4, and I walked into the conference room carrying a stack of presentation folders and Audrey's laptop. The board members were already seated around the long table, 7 men and 2 women, all in suits that probably cost more than my monthly rent. They looked up when we entered, their faces polite but distant. I was furniture to them, just another assistant setting up equipment. Audrey took her seat at the head of the table and opened her laptop while I distributed the folders. My hands were steadier than they'd been that morning, but I still felt off. The bruise on my jaw was impossible to ignore, and I caught a couple of the board members glancing at it. No one said anything, though. They weren't the type to ask personal questions. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Audrey walked them through quarterly projections, addressed concerns about a recent acquisition, and fielded questions with the same calm precision she brought to everything. I took notes, pulled up spreadsheets when she needed them, and tried to stay invisible. By the time it ended, my head was pounding again, and all I wanted was to go home, collapse on the couch, and not think about anything. When the last board member left, Audrey started packing up her things. I gathered the folders, stacking them neatly, and waited for her usual post-meeting debrief. She always had notes, corrections, things she wanted done differently next time. But tonight, she just closed her laptop and looked at me. "You did well today." I blinked, caught off guard. Audrey didn't give compliments. She gave feedback, pointed out flaws, and expected you to fix them. "Thank you." She picked up her laptop bag and slung it over her shoulder, then walked toward the door. I followed. Turning off the lights and closing the conference room behind us, we walked back to the office in silence, the hallway empty now that most people had gone home. When we reached my desk, she stopped. "You should take tomorrow off." I looked at her, confused. "I'm fine. I don't need a day off." "You're not fine," she said bluntly. "You're exhausted. You're in pain. And you're not going to be any use to me if you push yourself into the ground." I wanted to argue, to tell her I could handle it. But the truth was she was right. I was barely holding it together. And the idea of sleeping in, of not having to drag myself out of bed at 5:30, sounded impossibly good. "What about your schedule tomorrow?" "I'll manage," she said. "Take the day. Rest. Spend time with your son." The mention of Eli made something tighten in my chest. I thought about the way he'd looked at my bruised face last night, the worry in his eyes. He was 6 years old. He shouldn't have to worry about me. "Okay," I said finally. "Thank you." She nodded, then turned toward her office. But before she opened the door, she looked back at me. "Ryan." "Yeah. You don't have to carry everything alone." The words hit me harder than I expected. I stood there, unable to respond, and she didn't wait for me to. She went into her office, gathered her things, and left a few minutes later. I watched her go, then sat down at my desk, staring at nothing. I'd spent the last 3 years convinced that Audrey Lancaster was exactly what she appeared to be. Cold, detached, focused only on results. But today had shown me something else. She'd noticed I was struggling. She'd made me breakfast. She'd shared a piece of her past that she didn't have to share. And now she was giving me a day off, not because I'd asked, but because she could see I needed it. I thought about what she'd said earlier, about growing up in foster care, about learning to rely only on herself. I thought about the walls she'd built and the way she'd let me see past them, even if just for a moment. It made me wonder what else I'd been wrong about. Not just about her, but about myself. About the idea that asking for help meant weakness, that pushing through pain was the same as being strong. I finished up a few last emails, shut down my computer, and grabbed my jacket. The office was quiet now, just the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of the cleaning crew working on another floor. I locked up and headed to my car. My jaw still aching, but my mind clearer than it had been all day. When I got home, Eli was waiting for me at the neighbor's door, backpack on, drawing in hand. He ran to me the moment he saw me, and I caught him, lifting him up despite the protest from my sore muscles. "Did you have a good day?" I asked. He nodded, then touched my face gently, the same way he had last night. "Does it still hurt?" "A little, but I'm okay." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. We walked back to our apartment, and I made dinner while he worked on homework at the kitchen table. Spaghetti with marinara sauce, simple but filling. We ate together, talking about his day at school, his friend Marcus, who'd brought a frog to class, the spelling test he'd aced. After dinner, I helped him with his reading homework, then let him watch a cartoon while I cleaned up. As I stood at the sink, washing dishes, I thought about Audrey again, about the breakfast tray, about the way she'd looked at me when she said I didn't have to carry everything alone. I'd built my life around the idea that I had to do everything myself, that needing help meant I was failing. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe strength wasn't about how much you could endure in silence. Maybe it was about knowing when to let someone in. I put Eli to bed at 8, read him a chapter from his favorite book, and kissed him goodnight. Then I sat in the living room with a cup of tea, replaying the day in my head. The pain in my jaw had dulled to a background ache, manageable now. But the shift I felt inside was harder to name. Wasn't relief exactly, or gratitude, though both of those were there. It was something deeper, a loosening of the grip I'd kept on everything for so long. The next morning, I woke up without an alarm for the first time in months. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, and I lay there for a minute, just breathing. My jaw still hurt, but less than yesterday. I got up, made breakfast for Eli, and dropped him off at school. Then I went back home and did nothing. I didn't check my work email. I didn't plan out the week ahead. I just sat on the couch, drank coffee, and let myself rest. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a text. I picked it up and saw Audrey's name on the screen. "How are you feeling?" I stared at the message for a moment, then typed back. "Better. Thank you for yesterday." Her response came a minute later. "Good. See you tomorrow." Short, professional, classic Audrey. But I found myself smiling anyway. The following day, I went back to work. The bruise on my jaw had faded to a dull yellow, less noticeable now. I walked into the office feeling more like myself, and when I sat down at my desk, Audrey came out of her office almost immediately. "Welcome back." "Thanks. How did yesterday go?" "Fine, nothing I couldn't handle." She set a folder on my desk, the same way she always did, and went over the day's schedule. Meetings at 9 and 11. A conference call at 2. Documents to review before the end of the day. Everything back to normal. Except it wasn't quite normal, because something had changed. The way she looked at me was different, softer somehow. And the way I looked at her had changed too. Over the next few weeks, we settled into a new rhythm. Audrey was still demanding, still precise. Still the same sharp CEO she'd always been. But there were small shifts, subtle ones. She asked how Eli was doing. She noticed when I looked tired and told me to take breaks. She brought coffee to my desk on mornings when she knew I had a lot on my plate, and I started letting her. Not in big ways, but in small ones. I stopped pretending I had everything under control all the time. I asked for help when I needed it. I let myself be human instead of a machine. One Friday afternoon, after a particularly long week, Audrey stopped by my desk on her way out. "Any plans this weekend?" "Taking Eli to the park," I said, "trying to get some sun before winter hits." She nodded, then hesitated, like she was deciding whether to say something. "I'm glad you're doing better." "Me too. And for what it's worth, thank you. For noticing. For caring." She gave me a small smile, the kind I'd never seen from her before. "That's what good bosses do." "No," I said. "That's what good people do." She didn't respond, but something in her expression told me the words had landed. She left a moment later, and I finished up my work, thinking about how much had changed in just a few weeks, how a single act of kindness had shifted everything. That night, after Eli went to bed, I sat in the kitchen with a notebook and wrote down a thought that had been circling in my head for days. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let someone see you're not okay. I read it over a few times, then closed the notebook and went to bed. The bruise on my jaw was almost gone now, just a faint shadow. But the lesson it had taught me was still there, clear and solid. Being strong didn't mean suffering in silence. It didn't mean doing everything alone. It meant knowing when to accept help, when to let someone care, when to admit that you're human and fallible and doing the best you can. And maybe, just maybe, it meant letting yourself be surprised by the people around you, by their kindness, by their depth, by the ways they could see you, really see you, when you thought no one was looking.